Did you find matches on a number of latent prints?
We were able to identify 19 of the 178.
And you categorized those as positive identifications?
Yes, sir.
Does Exhibit 749 show the identification of the defendant's left thumb on the magazine entitled Hustler, Barely Legal?
Yes, sir, it does.
How many individualizing characteristics on this exhibit?
17.
I'd like to go to Exhibit 750 next. Is this the identification of the defendant's left thumb, or did I miss? Is that it?
Well, 750 is an enhydrant print.
That's an enhydrant print, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
It's 750.
And is that the identification of Mr. Jackson's left thumb on the magazine Hustler, Barely Legal, Hardcore?
Right. 317R, page 54.
How many?
Latent 1.
How many points of comparison in the exhibit?
18 total points.
Exhibit 751. Is this Gavin Arvizo's left middle finger in the same magazine, Hustler, Barely Legal, Hardcore?
Page 52, marked Latent 1.
And how many individualizing characteristics did you find there?
We had 21 detailed.
21.
21.
21,000 prints from this case. Are you kidding me? Now, more fingerprints on more X-rated magazines.
752, please. Is this Gavin left middle finger found on the magazine Hustler, Barely Legal, Hardcore, Sheriff's Item 317L?
That's correct. Latent 2, page 92.
How many individualizing characteristics did you find in that?
13.
13?
13.
Exhibit 753, please. It appears to depict Gavin left index finger, Sheriff's Item 317R, Hustler, Barely Legal, Hardcore.
Correct. Page 92, marked Latent number 4.
And how many individualizing characteristics did you find on that print?
14 total.
Is that the defendant's left thumb in the magazine Visions of Fantasy?
Visions of Fantasy, Hard Rock Affair, page 3, marked Latent number 1, and we had again 21 points.
Okay, item 757, please. Is that Gavin right middle finger in the magazine Visions of Fantasy, or did I not?
I don't think you changed it. We need 758.
That's where we are.
Item 317YY is Al Goldstein's 100 Best Adult Videos. It was from page A, marked Latent number 1, and it's the left index finger of Gavin. We had 18 total points.
Now, if your eyes are glazing over, folks, so were the judges. At the end of all of this testimony, he remarked something to the effect, okay, I can't take it anymore. Let's take a recess. He calls it a day.
20 minutes early, in
Oh,
fact.
my goodness. So, you know, that's saying a lot. But let's kind of start at the beginning. Of course, we got a lot to say about all of this evidence. Let's start at the beginning, sort of lay the foundation for our viewers, if you will, about this kind of evidence. Fingerprints, points of comparison, the numbering system. Lay it all out for us. Howard, why don't you start?
Well, I think it's solid evidence. For me, this is the first piece of evidence, testimony, that I've seen that may allow a jury to infer that Michael Jackson might have done something inappropriate. You have fingerprints of both Michael's and the young man on the same magazine, albeit not on the same page, but at least there's an inference that they were looking at the same thing at or about the same time. So taking Ricky's CSI analogy that I think is very real, this evidence has some substance for jurors, I believe, and is not good for Michael Jackson.
Well, yes. They were looking at things at the same magazines, but not necessarily at the same time. And that's what's of critical importance. As we said before, they can't date the timing of these prints. So Michael Jackson may have looked at these magazines at some time. And I think we're going to hear testimony that these kids ran wild and got into these magazines themselves, and that becomes of critical importance.
And indeed, we know that, Ricky, because some of the cross-examination questions went toward that. And the idea, though, 21,000 prints?
Well, they take 21,000 prints from Michael Jackson's residence on items of perhaps of evidentiary value, perhaps not. But he says there's only 178 prints that he can use for comparison. And when it comes down to it, there are very few prints indeed that come to the critical issue. In fact, there are 19 of them. Yes. The most important ones are the ones we just heard about, which would put the accuser's fingers and Michael Jackson's finger on a particular magazine, which is Hustler, Barely Legal, Hardcore, which is from October of 2000.
Exactly.
Sean and Howard are both correct. We know that it's hard scientific evidence, it's factual evidence, those fingerprints are on there. Sean is right, we don't know when they happened. But for the prosecution, this is to say it is more likely than not that we should believe the accuser and his brother because these prints are on the same mag.
Did you notice, by the way, that Ricky had to read the title of that magazine? It's not something she's familiar with.
I will ceremoniously leave that comment alone.
I will say categorically, I have never owned that magazine.
Or never saw it, didn't know it existed. Let's just leave this whole thing alone, shall we? Next, the accuser's fingerprints weren't the only ones that showed up on Michael Jackson's private pornography stash.
If you could please compare what is on the board to the exhibit in front of you and read the exhibit number for the jury, please.
This exhibit number is exhibit number 746.
Is that the positive identification you made with Michael Jackson's left little finger on page 52 of the magazine entitled Barely Legal?
Yes, sir.
Okay, move to the next exhibit, please. Is that exhibit 747?
That's correct.
Would you look at the screen, please? Does that accurately depict the positive identification of Star left middle finger on page 31 of the magazine entitled Finally Legal?
Yes, sir, it does.
When you initially began comparing a latent print to some of these known prints from the three individuals we named, did you look at them with the intention of going back through the material over and over again?
Well, when we first went through the first ones, what we did was we went through an initial evaluation and located prints which we felt could be an identification, and we marked those. And when we finished going through all the prints that came down on an individual CD disc for that day or 2 days, then we would go back to the ones that we were interested in and re-review those fingerprints.
Okay, so they would get a first look and then a more thorough look at a later time.
Yes, sir, they would.
But, Sean Chapman-Holly, as we will learn in a little while, and as has been alluded to by this defense team, there was a lot of handling of these very same items during the grand jury proceedings, perhaps leaving prints.
Yes, and of course you're going to say shades of OJ, right? There's
You're looking at my notes. Stop it.
No, I know you now, James. Yes, we're going to hear lots of testimony today, in fact, about how this was handled, how things perhaps were tampered with, mislabeled, all sorts of things that I think harken back to the O.J. Simpson defense.
You know, the real problem with evidence like this is the defense really can't present evidence to contradict this, even though this witness is dull and not very dynamic.
But we're dynamic and not dull.
But he's like, but let's hover on that point for just a moment. He's like a cop should be. I mean, this stuff is just the facts, a Joe Friday kind of thing.
That's right.
That's what you want out of a police officer who's dealing with forensic evidence, don't you?
Yeah.
Okay.
He seems credible.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yes. This is, this is an interesting situation because there can be no doubt these prints are on the magazines.
Sure.
I mean, they are not going to contest it. And so the reality is, it goes back to Sean's point. It's when did they get there? Well, probably these kids also had their hands on these magazines while they were at Neverland, whether it was with Michael Jackson or without. So using the idea that it happened in the grand jury, that's how his prints get on there, that can sometimes prove to be too much.
It might backfire on the defense. And one point before we go, is it of note, defense counsel extraordinaire, that the prints on the magazines that come from Michael Jackson only share one magazine in common, and there are 8 through 19. There are about 11 magazines of the 19 that have Michael Jackson prints. Yeah, 11 of the magazines that have Michael Jackson's prints on them, but only one of those 11 share prints in common that also have the prints of Gavin, the accuser, on them. Well, and his prints are only on 4 total.
The theory is that Michael showed them the magazines. I believe, not that he had them turn the pages. So I don't know how helpful that is.
All right. Maybe I'm just making much ado about too much magazine. Well, when we return, top flight police work or a comedy of errors that would have some tragic consequences. Stay with us.
The reenactments and commentary in this program may contain frank talk of a sexual nature. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome back. Well, we've talked a lot about witness credibility on this program, but credibility of the evidence is just as important. And earlier, Assistant District Attorney Gordon Auchincloss attempted to head off possible charges of sloppy police work. Here's what forensic expert Timothy Sutcliffe said, according to the courtroom transcripts.
What is the accurate letter for that particular item number?
The item number is 321F.
And you said you were certain that that item number is 321F.
That is correct.
Objection, leading.
Sustained.
Are you certain that is item 321F?
Yes, I am.
Why?
A couple of things. When we received the magazine and we were doing our report at the time we were processing the magazine, we were processing Finally Legal. That was the magazine. Subsequently, when we noticed that the tags had been switched, we noticed that 321D was actually associated with the Hawk magazine.
Does a circle that you identified that particular fingerprint with have any similarities to the circle to the right that appears in the image?
Yes, it does.
Now, as you might expect, if you were able to follow that testimony, there's no way that the defense would let that issue rest.
And in the course of your training to become a member of the Forensics Bureau, was it emphasized that it is extremely important to make sure that all of the evidence, tags, and paperwork and everything else is extremely accurate?
Absolutely.
All right. So based on your training and experience, this was not correct police procedure to have this exhibit mislabeled in this case. Is that correct?
It should not have been mislabeled. That's correct.
And tags should not be switched. Is that correct? I think those are your words. The tags were switched.
Yes, meaning not purposely, but accidentally switched.
Well, tags should not be switched, correct?
Correct.
All right. And you caught this particular one, right?
That was the only one.
That's the only one you caught.
We checked them all.
Objection, argumentative.
You went back and you checked them all.
There's an objection.
Just a moment. It's overruled. The answer was we checked them all. Next question.
Checked them all, meaning all the fingerprints?
Checked every magazine to make sure it was properly labeled.
I'm sorry, I meant all the materials that you had for the fingerprints.
Correct.
Were you aware of any other tags falling off in this particular investigation?
Not to my knowledge.
And you would agree, based on your training and experience, that it's important to try to label all these things carefully so that ultimately, if you're called to testify in court, you can get it right.
Absolutely.
Okay. And eventually it was determined, you believe at this time, that that print really came off a different magazine.
Oh, I know it did.
Okay, that's your testimony at this point.
Correct.
All right. And by the way, the fingerprints that you lifted, do you have any way to determine the age of the fingerprints?
No.
So you can't tell if one was laid down before another, correct?
Correct.
And you can't tell just even in general, other than, for instance, looking at the date of a magazine or something like that, you can't tell scientifically when a particular print was placed there.
Correct.
Ricky Kleeman, this is a great line of questioning, but I don't want to talk to you about that last portion. What I do want to talk to you about is the big picture with respect to garbage in, garbage out, I suppose, would be the theme of the defense theory at this point, that they messed up this particular labeling, this particular print. One print was on magazine A, should have been on magazine B. Therefore, you can't believe any of it? Is that where the defense is going?
I don't think so. I think that they have an absolute right and a duty to attack the fact that these things were mislabeled, that they had the tags on the wrong ones, because it is sloppy police work and these things shouldn't happen. However, in this particular case, it may just simply be irrelevant, because we do know that the prints of Gavin and a print of Michael wind up on one magazine. This is a separate issue, but I don't blame them for raising it.
One magazine, but two different pages. Go ahead.
Yes. And the thing is, you can't trust the message if you can't trust the messenger.
Okay.
And I don't know. And this all, again, falls under the big theme, in my view, of rush to judgment, which is that the DA's office and the Sheriff's Department are all out to get Michael.
Come on. Now you gotta...
Let me finish.
All right.
Okay, so there's a rush to judgment. They want to get him. The sloppy police work all falls in line with that. They have a bias. The bias is that this guy's bad, he's a child molester, and they're going to get him.
Yeah,
but it's different than a whodunit. I mean, the rush to judgment theme works with O.J. Simpson and obviously was very successful for you because it was a question of who did it. It's a different question when we have an issue here that this boy says Michael did it. I mean, they're not going to go look for someone else.
And it's straightforward stuff, though. And Howard, come on, a few seconds left right here. But the kids
say one thing.
The kids say he showed me mags. They find prints on the mags. It's in evidence. This is not rocket science. This is straightforward stuff.
I would have zeroed in on one thing in this officer's testimony. He said that labels were switched accidentally, not purposely. I would have said, did you switch the labels? No.
Then
you
how do
don't
you
know
know
if they were switched accidentally or not, do you?
Good point.
And I would have let it right there.
Accidental, or hold that thought, accidental or purposeful, handled or mishandled. Assistant District Attorney Magna Cola questions Alicia Romero, a new witness. She's a court supervisor who was in charge of monitoring the important exhibits during the grand jury proceedings. A program note, Stephen Dunkel is a lawyer who works with the defense attorney Robert Singer.
Okay, so you observed everything that would happen with the exhibits.
Yes.
And that's how you were assured there would be no tampering, correct?
Yes.
Did you watch Detective Bonner remove the contents of the briefcase, begin photographing page for page?
Yes.
And Detective Bonner was wearing gloves on that occasion as well, correct?
Yes.
When he was finished photo documenting all the contents of Grand Jury Exhibit 53, also known as People's Exhibit 470, did he replace all the items in the same order that he removed them and closed the briefcase again?
Objection, compound, and leading.
Should I rephrase?
Sustained.
Okay. When he finished taking the pictures, he put it all back together again.
He placed them back in the suitcase. Whether they were in the same order that they were taken out, I do not know.
So he may have shuffled them as far as you know.
Correct.
Did he close the briefcase and hand it back to you?
Yes.
Did he examine other exhibits on the same day?
Yes, he did.
Okay. And did he, in your presence, take care to handle only one exhibit at a time?
Yes.
You made sure of that, I take it.
Yes.
Do you recall if they were wearing gloves when they went through the exhibits?
The procedure was to wear gloves.
Okay. Was there...
I'm sorry.
Let me back up to the date that Mr. Sanger and Mr. Dunkel reviewed the exhibits on July 21st. Were they wearing gloves?
Mr. Dunkel was. I believe Mr. Sanger was letting Mr. Dunkel handle them on that date, from what I recall.
Defense attorney Robert Sanger wants jurors to know that Michael Jackson isn't the only gloved one. Ooh, who wrote that? Another quick note, Amy Cassell is an investigator for the Jackson team.
First of all, is there anything unusual about a defense lawyer coming to, or a defense lawyer and investigator coming to look at grand jury exhibits?
No.
And at the time that Mr. Dunkel from my office came, and the one time that I came to look at the grand jury exhibits, was the grand jury process completed?
Yes.
In other words, the grand jury had already looked at everything. They'd returned their indictment, and you were now safekeeping the exhibits.
Correct.
All right. Now, just to do the whole thing at once so we can break it down, during the time that Mr. Dunkel was there from my office, the one that I was there, and the two investigators, in other words, those 3 times, did all of the personnel from my office, including myself, follow all of your directions with regard to preserving and avoiding any contamination of the evidence?
As I recall, yes.
And you were sitting there at the table each time, taking the evidence out and allowing whoever it was, whether it was me or any of the others, to look at it, correct?
Correct.
And none of us touched the evidence in any way that you did not want us to do. Is that correct?
Correct.
All right. And by the time that we did that, by the time these inspections by the defense occurred, were you told to wear gloves and to preserve the evidence?
Yes, we were. From the very first visit, Mr. Dunkel and I think it was Castle, were told to wear gloves at all times.
And we all complied with that, right?
Correct.
Now, Ricky Kleeman, this is a little interesting. You have a court clerk. This isn't a cop. This isn't a forensic technician. This is a courtroom clerk, somebody who works under the auspices of the judge. That's who her boss is, ultimately testifying about what happened with respect to Prince.
Well, because what happens is the defense has a very reasonable attack on the fact that when it went into the grand jury, the case goes in the grand jury, the magazines go in the grand jury, that perhaps that's when Gavin touched this magazine. So what the defense needs to do is say, hey, look, the police may have been wearing gloves, but once we got to the courthouse, the gloves were off.
And Howard Weitzman, isn't Ricky's previous point really the correct one here, though? And I have to agree. That is, this is way too much time on this little itty-bitty point by the defense or by the prosecution.
Well, clearly the defense gets the Good Citizen Award for following instructions as the clerk told them to.
Yes, it is.
Honestly, to me, almost meaningless the way it was presented.
Yeah. You agree?
Well, yes, and ultimately, I think at the end there's going to be a circumstantial evidence instruction, which says really that there are 2 theories as to the dating of these fingerprints.
Yeah.
If one of them points to innocence and one of them points to guilt, the jurors will be instructed they must choose the one that points to innocence. And if the defense is offering a reasonable theory that the kids got into it at one time, Michael at another time, the jury instruction will say you got to follow that.
Very well
Except
said.
this witness doesn't help that.
Well,
That's true.
We'll talk about that as we continue, but that instruction is a powerful one, and prosecutors hate it.
Love it.
When we return, the tangled web of evidence handling. Is it tight enough to catch a suspect, or is the entire process full of holes? Stay with us.
Reenactments and commentary in this program may contain frank talk of a sexual nature. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome back. As we continue, defense attorney Robert Sanger takes the gloves off literally. Oh, I can hear those fingers clicking away, sending those emails. But here's what the court supervisor, Alicia Romero, told jurors according to the courtroom transcripts. Now, a programming note. She mentions an individual, Gary Blair. Gary Blair is the executive officer, her boss, just below the judge of the Santa Barbara County Superior Courts.
All right. Now, prior to that, on the day that you got the materials from the grand jury, my understanding is all you did was take them in a box or so.
Yes. Gary Blair and Christy Russell, that was the courtroom clerk, brought them about almost 6 o'clock that evening. And Christy and I, we put it in the vault immediately.
All right. Was anybody wearing gloves?
No.
Okay, and after you put them in the vault, you locked it up, and then you came back the next day, correct?
First thing the next morning, yes.
And who assisted you in inventorying the material?
The courtroom clerk that took the indictment.
And the courtroom clerk was?
Christy Russell.
So you and Miss Russell then took the boxes out, and you went through each exhibit to catalog and make sure it was all there, is that right?
Correct.
And did each of you wear gloves?
No, we did not.
And you were not instructed by law enforcement or other court personnel or anybody else that you should wear gloves. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. Okay, thank you. I have no further questions.
So the defense thinks that evidence was improperly handled. Well, guess what? The Assistant District Attorney, Magnicola, completely disagrees.
Essentially, there was nothing improper in the way that the exhibits were handled by other parties in the case, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
When you did your inventory of the exhibits for the first time, did you open up exhibit number 470, which is the black briefcase that you know as Exhibit 53?
Yes.
Okay. And did you look at every single page that was in there?
No, we did not.
How did you handle that? Could you explain that for the jury, please?
Okay. When we were inventory, we had this black suitcase. We have to account for every exhibit. So when we got to the black suitcase, our procedure is there anything in there that was overlooked that we should make a note on the exhibit card? So we looked in it, and all we saw was magazines. And we just sort of I think it was myself rather than Christy, we just sort of moved it, just magazines. And then we just closed it. But we didn't touch all the exhibits.
You don't work for law enforcement, do you?
No, I don't.
And law enforcement doesn't get to tell court clerks what to do, right?
Objection calls for speculation.
Sustained.
Howard Weitzman, come on, what? The defense is beating up on the court clerk now?
Well, it's even worse than that. The inference cannot be that she planted Michael Jackson or the accuser's fingerprints on these magazines. So this is a witness I probably would not even cross-examine, just let her go.
So is the danger, Sean Chapman, Holly, that the defense now is perhaps losing some points with this jury?
Perhaps.
Despite the comments of the elected district attorney about the Blake jury.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, you may be right that at this point it's getting into much ado about nothing.
Yeah.
Since the defense theory is that, yes, these kids got onto the magazines, their fingerprints are going to be on it, Michael's fingerprints are going to be on it because they're his magazines. So it's like, okay, so what? Come on.
So you agree with me?
Of course I do.
Oh, gee, she always agrees with you,
Well,
but...
this is a rare time. I think we all agree, and all four of us have tried a lot of cases. There does come a point where you just have to give it up, because then the important points that you have get lost because they're in a sea of insignificant points.
And that's really the big issue here. But one of the salient, good, positive points for the defense has to be this whole you can't age a fingerprint issue, which came
Spoken
up
like a true defense attorney.
Well, I mean,
James.
it's a good point because it's the best point they make, but they made it 2 exams ago.
It's the only point you can make in cross-examining a fingerprint expert. The very first examination I ever had to do as a defense lawyer after being a prosecutor was I was assigned cross-examination of a fingerprint in a federal case, and I really realized I had nothing to say, with the exception of the fact that you can't age a fingerprint. It's the only point of vulnerability.
And red herring, perhaps, but perhaps these jurors will be impressed if they can remember the point because it was made so darn long ago. Well, were the rules followed? That's the all-important question.
When Mr. Sanger asked you whether you were told what to do with the exhibits by law enforcement, is that a common procedure for you?
It wasn't necessarily by law enforcement. It was from Gary Blair.
Okay, so my question is, does law enforcement generally direct you how to handle exhibits once they're lodged with the court?
No, they do not.
They become court property at that point, correct?
Correct.
Proper procedure, improper procedure, or a violation of the common sense doctrine? Defense attorney Robert Sanger continues to grill, and we don't know why, this witness.
Okay, but law enforcement did tell you that after you had inventoried everything, at some point before my office came to look at the materials, somebody told you that everybody should wear gloves when dealing with this material, correct?
It was Gary Blair. And I believe Detective Bonner at one time did mention, you clerks, I mean, you should really wear gloves when you're handling it. It wasn't an order, it was more like a request.
All right.
But I took my instructions from Gary Blair.
Gary Blair is the court administrator?
Yes, he is.
So he would be your boss, as it were?
Correct.
When you say you don't take direction from law enforcement on handling exhibits, well, I don't know what you said, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. Let's put it this way. The fact is that you've been a courtroom clerk in the past, correct?
Correct.
And the fact is, if law enforcement is handling something with gloves and they indicate there may be some reason to check something for fingerprints, you would act accordingly, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so if law enforcement were to tell you, if they had told you before you took possession of these items that you shouldn't go through them because they may be checking them for fingerprints, you would have honored that request, right?
Yes, I would have.
Okay, and that has happened before, has it not?
Correct.
Now, one of the issues here, and we discussed this a little bit while we were listening to this testimony, is what we all learned in law school about what I was taught, an apparent cross-examination. You really don't have anything to say, but you ask a forceful question, you do it with zest and gusto, and then you sit down, even though it doesn't really mean anything. That's not even what happens here.
And sometimes it really takes a lot of courage as a lawyer to not ask anything, and sometimes that's the most powerful examination of all, none.
Yeah, I have to agree with Sean. There's nothing better than saying, I don't have any questions. A little wave of the witness and sit down to trivialize the examination of the witness on direct.
It does signal insignificance to the jurors sometimes when you just say no questions.
Of course, because it's like, not worthy of a response. Interesting here, what you wind up with is the pop-up syndrome. You know, the assistant DA, the defense, the assistant DA, the defense. And the reality is what you have to say to your client from the defense side is you have to say, in this case, to Michael Jackson, Michael, if I'm not asking any questions, don't worry. It's really a good thing not to ask questions here. But there is this overwhelming compulsion that it's not only these trial lawyers, we see it all the time, of just not being able.
It's happened to me. I've been there. I understand.
We all have.
Yeah.
But here there is a point where even the judge, as we know, just had enough.
Toward the end of this. Now let's talk about something a little off point. But the Los Angeles District Attorney apparently made a comment that was at best ill-advised about the Robert Blake juror. Did you guys hear about this?
Yeah.
Yes, he called the juror stupid.
It was just, that's right, he called the juror stupid because of the verdict they arrived at the Blake case. The thing that concerns me the most for the citizens of the County of Los Angeles is that it could potentially taint jury pools in the future. It was a very inappropriate and injudicious
And that's my point.
remark.
And we need to be clear, as you correctly instructed me and corrected me, that we need to clarify that that is not the jurisdiction, the county within which this trial is being conducted. This is Santa Barbara District Attorney's Office. That was the LA DA who made that comment.
But while saying that, you know, they're close, and we share a lot of the same news feed. And the difficulty is this: if you are a juror who is going to court, you would you give that up, your time, your days, your months,
for a whopping
like
$5 a day or something like that.
And that you would like to believe that you are doing the right thing, and this could affect other jurisdictions.
It could.
By the way,
never
James,
wanted that.
both counties are involved in the federal jury pool.
Okay,
Santa Barbara and LA.
We'll continue this discussion, how it sort of reverberates throughout these proceedings. But when we return, does all the evidence back up the story that the accuser and his brother told you? Be the judge.
The reenactments and commentary in this program may contain frank talk of a sexual nature. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome back. Now, the jury has heard from a number of detectives and crime scene analysts, heck, even the courtroom clerk that was responsible for the grand jury proceedings. But does all the prosecution evidence support the earlier testimony about Michael Jackson's girly magazines from the brother of the accuser and the accuser himself? Let's find out as we go back and hear what the accuser's younger brother, Star David, told the jurors when questioned by District Attorney Tom Sneddon, according to the courtroom transcripts.
Did you ever see that black suitcase that's been marked as People's 470 before? After that, after the time that you discussed...
Yes.
Where?
It was upstairs in his bed area.
Where?
In his where his bed was.
And where in his bedroom?
Near the TV.
All right. And where were you?
What do you mean?
Where were you in the bedroom?
On the bed.
All right. Who was with you?
Aldo, my brother, and Michael.
And where was the suitcase located? I mean, how did you ever look at the suitcase inside of it?
Yes.
What happened?
There was adult material in there.
All right. But how did it get opened?
Michael pulled it out.
All right. Tell us what he did.
He picked it up, sat on the bed, and opened it.
And then what?
He pulled the magazine out and started showing us.
How many magazines do you think you saw that time?
4, 3, I don't know.
Did you look through the entire magazines?
No, it was probably a section or something like that.
What did you see in the magazines?
Nude females.
What?
Nude females.
Do you remember the names of any of the titles of the magazines that you saw?
Barely Legal and Playboy.
Now, that testimony, interestingly enough, is pretty consistent with the evidence as we know it. His fingerprints, Star David's, are only on 2 of the several magazines that we heard testimony about earlier. Now, under questioning by the district attorney, it was certainly a piece of cake for the young witness, but defense attorney Tom Mesereau made sure that he couldn't have his cake and eat it too.
Okay, just what you're looking at appears to be a black briefcase with some girly magazines, right?
Yes.
And the first one says Barely Legal on it. Do you see that?
Yes.
And it appears to be a blonde woman lifting up her shirt, correct?
Yes.
And it appears to be a blonde woman who's exposing her breasts, right?
Yes.
And she appears to be wearing a dark pair of shorts, right?
Yes.
Before you testified yesterday, you looked at that photograph with Prosecutor Sneddon, correct?
Yes.
You told Prosecutor Sneddon that those are the magazines you had seen at Neverland, right?
Yes.
You told Prosecutor Sneddon that Michael Jackson had showed you those magazines, right?
Yes.
Michael Jackson never showed you that magazine, Barely Legal, did he?
What?
And did you testify in the grand jury that you saw these magazines?
No, I said I saw those types of magazines.
Okay, Mr.
Yes.
You told Mr. Sneddon in no uncertain terms that those were the magazines you had seen, didn't you?
I said those are the types of magazines we saw.
Okay. Had you ever seen any girly magazines in your life before you say Michael Jackson showed them to you?
No.
Never?
Well, I was only like 11, 12.
Weren't you caught at Neverland looking in girly magazines?
I said no.
No one ever caught you and your brother looking at girly magazines at Neverland?
Never.
Okay, okay. And your testimony is until you got to Neverland, you and your brother had never looked at a girly magazine at any time. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, Ricky, we're looking here at some earlier testimony earlier in the trial that dovetail pretty well. Let me just ask you the question. Do you think it dovetailed pretty well with the fingerprint evidence that we
Sure. What we're doing here is exactly what the jury should be doing. That is, they hear the fingerprint evidence from the experts, and they go, oh, I remember when Star said this, or I remember when Gavin said this. What we find is that there are 2 prints of the accuser's brother. They are on an issue of Finally Legal as opposed to Barely Legal.
Yeah.
And that was published in December of 2000. So that does corroborate the fact, if you want to believe that that's when Michael Jackson showed it to him. But Tom Mesereau says, hey, wait a minute, weren't you caught looking at these magazines? So I assume Mesereau has the witness who's going to say that.
And Sean Chapman-Holly, I misspoke earlier. I said his fingerprints were on 2 of the magazines. There were 2 of his prints on the same magazine, the Finally Legal. Howard, notice I'm reading it too. Finally Legal from December of 2000. There are 19 total magazines, Sean Chapman-Holly. One of the magazines, there were 19 total prints
right,
of several magazines, perhaps 6 or 7 magazines. Only one of the magazines has the brothers' prints on them. Only 3 of the magazines have the accuser's prints on them. The rest, all Michael Jackson.
Right.
So what does it mean?
Well, it means that Michael Jackson has these magazines in his home. As we've heard, they're legal. It's not inappropriate for a man of his age to have these type of magazines. And of course, you know, the importance for the prosecution is that it corroborates Howard's smiling. Is
Get
it
her, Howard, get her.
inappropriate to have these magazines, Howard?
Well, I don't know, but how would you know one way or the other?
All right, we're digressing. Let me just cut this off right now. The bottom line is that with all the scientific evidence being presented, doesn't it still all come down to the accuser's credibility? And certainly, if you listen to these folks here, they tend to see it that way. So as we continue, here's what the accuser said according to the courtroom transcripts earlier in his testimony. And we want you to remember that the actor portraying the accuser bears no resemblance to the actual accuser.
Now, when you first saw the suitcase, where was it in that room?
It was to the left of the couch thing.
And did you ever see Mr. Jackson pick up the exhibit 470?
Yeah, like I was hanging out with him in there, and he was like putting on his makeup or something. I don't know. And then he grabbed the suitcase, and then he told me it was Frank's, and he showed me. He was like,
okay,
"This is."
And what did he show you?
He was like, look at this stuff. Frank's stinking ASS. Frank's stinking, it was S. Frank's stinking ass.
All right. What was inside the suitcase?
Adult materials.
And how many did you look at with Mr. Jackson?
Well, he showed me just one. Like, he showed me, and there was this girl in there, and then he put it away.
And how was the girl?
She had her legs spread open, and her vagina was, like, showing.
All right. Did you ever see that suitcase again?
Yes.
Where?
We had it up in near his bed, and then we were looking at all the stuff.
Who was we?
Me, my brother, and Michael.
And do you recall where in the bedroom was the suitcase when you first saw it that time?
The first time I saw it, it was in the restroom kind of thing. And then the second time I don't know if we brought it up there or like Michael brought it up there or something, I don't know. But it was up next to his bed, and we were all going through the thing, and we were making fun of Frank.
Did you look at the magazines?
Yes.
How many magazines do you think you saw?
We saw like practically everything, but there was a few we didn't look at.
How much time do you figure you were looking at all those things?
30 minutes to an hour, probably.
Did Mr. Jackson make any comments during the time, other than the ones you've talked about? Any other comments that he made at any of the photographs or the magazines?
Not really. We just were, like, making fun of Frank.
All right, Sean Chapman Holly, they're making fun of Frank. So what? Why do we care about this? And how is this relevant to what the issue is here in this case, that Michael Jackson was grooming these kids?
Well, I guess it's just providing a scenario that this is the way that Michael Jackson brought the magazines to the attention of these boys, by making fun of Frank. Oh, look what Frank has, look at these magazines. I guess to add to the prosecution's theory that he's grooming the boys, and this is how he presents it for the first time.
But I do find it curious, Howard, that as I continue to review the layout of these fingerprints, again, 5 prints total of the accuser found, but only 3 total magazines, only 1 magazine that prints are on for his brother. That doesn't seem to line up.
What this testimony indicates to me is that this case was choreographed wrong by the district attorneys.
How do you mean?
Well, the boys clearly were not great witnesses. They should have been put on as witnesses after, as I now look at the evidence, after the scientific evidence. If you put the fingerprint on first, you put the discovery of the magazines on first, then their testimony corroborates evidence that was found. It doesn't just come out of the blue. And if I was choreographing the presentation of this case, I would have put my scientific evidence on first, at least what we've heard to date.
Right. We want to clarify, too, for our viewers, the Frank that you hear refers to Frank Tyson, an unindicted co-conspirator. We got to get back to that theme, as well as one of the Jackson entourage, or part of his Jackson team, if you will, there at Neverland Ranch. Still ahead, Michael Jackson talks about a conspiracy, a martyr, and a serious injury. Stay with us.
Reenactments and commentary in this program may contain frank talk of a sexual nature. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome back. On Easter Sunday, Michael Jackson was interviewed on the Reverend Jesse Jackson's radio show. And for those of you who don't know, they're not related. The King of Pop compared his legal problems to one of history's most inspiring figures.
I'm handling it by using other people in the past who have gone through this sort of thing. Mandela's story has given me a lot of strength, what he's gone through.
Okay, Howard Weitzman, we're going to appoint you as our resident expert on this interview. You listened to the whole thing. This is just a snippet. Give us your impression overall and this particular comparison.
Well, I think it was tragic that Michael compared his situation with an icon in the civil rights struggle, Nelson Mandela. He also mentioned Muhammad Ali's name and Jack Johnson's name. Look, those were people...
Both boxers, by the way. Jack Johnson
that's right.
Was a boxer from a while back,
that took convictions with respect to laws that were in effect, admitted what they did and said the laws were wrong. Michael Jackson is not in that position. He's not saying the law that he's charged with is wrong. He's saying he didn't do what he charged with. There's no rational basis, in my opinion, for him to make that
Perhaps
comparison.
ill-advised. We're going to get to what goes on in the psyche of an individual who's been a little sheltered, to say the least. Next, Michael Jackson fears that he's under attack, as Howard just alluded to, because of his valuable music library that includes rights to songs by Beatles and Elvis.
It's a huge catalog. It's very valuable. It's worth a lot of money, and there is a big fight going on right now as we speak about that. Now, I can't say whether or not. I can't comment on it. There's a lot of conspiracy. I'll say there's a lot of conspiracy going on as we speak.
Now, Sean Chapman-Holly, with respect to this conspiracy theory, even the Reverend Al Sharpton stepped away from Michael Jackson when he started talking about this a couple of years back.
Yes, he brought this up some time ago, and I think in conjunction with his saying that Tommy Mottola was a racist. And that whole thing, as I recall, went over like a lead balloon. People didn't really buy it and thought that he was kind of losing it at that point.
It was really something that turned into a bit of a spectacle. Finally, Jackson explained how he sustained that injury that made him late to court a few days ago.
I was coming out of the shower, and I fell. And all my body weight, I mean, I'm pretty fragile, all my body weight fell against my rib cage. And I pretty much, I bruised my lung very badly.
Ricky?
I think he is fragile, both physically and psychologically. I'm sure it happened that way. He even talked about Elizabeth Taylor feeding him.
And what does it say about this young man's mind? Be sure to watch us tomorrow at 9 p.m. We'll have the judge's ruling on whether the prior bad acts will be allowed.